What if we've misunderstood one of the central pillars of Christianity, the resurrection? What if Paul, in his most famous teaching on the resurrection, wasn't arguing for a physical resurrection at all? What if, instead, Paul followed the popular Greco-Roman myths of his time, where the divine escapes the physical body to ascend to the heavens? This question has fueled debates for centuries, where critics argue that Paul's theology reflects Greek dualism, a worldview that sees the physical world as corrupt and salvation as a spiritual escape. But what if the critics have it wrong? What if Paul's vision of resurrection was not influenced by Greek ideas at all, but rooted in the Jewish scriptures, specifically the book of Deuteronomy? One of the most common objections to the resurrection of Jesus is that Paul's teaching reflects Greek dualism, not Jewish theology. Critics often point to phrases like earthly bodies and heavenly bodies in 1 Corinthians 15, arguing that Paul saw resurrection as the soul escaping the physical body to ascend into a purely spiritual state. And let's be honest, at first glance, that might seem convincing. But here's what many people overlook. Paul's language and theology are deeply rooted in the Old Testament, particularly the book of Deuteronomy. And when we explore this connection, it not only clarifies what Paul's teaching on the resurrection, but also reveals a far richer and more profound vision than anything Greek dualism could offer. At the end of this video, you'll see why Paul's teaching on the resurrection is both uniquely Jewish and radically physical. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul lays out his famous teaching on the resurrection body. He begins by describing different kinds of flesh, saying, "Not all flesh is the same. There is one kind for humans, another for animals, another for birds, and another for fish." Then he shifts to heavenly bodies like the sun, moon, and stars, each marked by its own glory. Traditionally, scholars have pointed to Genesis 1 or even Greek cosmology as Paul's source for this list. But what if we've been looking in the wrong place? In Deuteronomy 4:15 through 19, Moses describes the cosmos as a structured hierarchy. Terrestrial creatures like humans, animals, birds, and fish are confined to the earth, while celestial bodies like the sun, moon, and stars occupy the heavens. Each part of creation has its own glory, a divinely assigned role within God's ordered universe. Now, here's the key. Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15 mirrors this structure almost exactly. He starts with terrestrial creatures, humans, animals, birds, and fish, and then moves to heavenly bodies, emphasizing their distinct glory. But Paul isn't just quoting Deuteronomy to describe creation. He's using this framework to explain something much deeper, the transformation that takes place in the resurrection. This shows that Paul isn't just making an analogy for the sake of it. He's drawing on something deeply foundational to Jewish theology, a structured, ordered cosmos where everything has a purpose and a role. But here's the thing. Paul doesn't just stop at describing creation. He's using this framework to make a radical claim about what happens to us in the resurrection. So, what exactly is he saying? Is he describing a body that's completely replaced? Or is he pointing to something far more transformative? To answer these questions, we need to address one of the biggest objections to Paul's theology. Was he influenced by Greek dualism? Critics argue that Paul's discussion of heavenly and earthly bodies in 1 Corinthians 15 reflects the Greek idea that the physical body is corrupt, and resurrection means ascending into a higher spiritual existence. At first glance, Paul's language might appear to align with this view. Greek philosophers like Plato taught that the physical world was inherently flawed and that the soul's true destiny was to escape the body and enter a pure spiritual realm. But is this really what Paul meant? In Greek dualism, the physical and spiritual are opposites. The body is seen as weak and corrupt, a temporary shell holding the eternal soul captive. Salvation, according to this worldview, comes through the shedding of the body and ascending to a purely spiritual plane. And this idea is reflected in many Greco-Roman myths, where gods or heroes ascend into the heavens in a process known as apotheosis. For example, Hercules was believed to have cast off his mortal body to join the gods on Mount Olympus. Now, in Jewish thought, the physical world isn't corrupt, it's good. Genesis 1 tells us that God created the heavens and the earth and declared them very good. The body is seen as an integral part of God's creation, not something to be escaped, but something to be redeemed. This is why the Old Testament repeatedly speaks of resurrection as physical and bodily. For example, Daniel 12:2 says, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth will wake." And Isaiah 26:19 declares, "Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise." The Jewish hope was never about escaping the body. It was about its renewal. This idea of bodily renewal is at the heart of Paul's theology. He wasn't borrowing from Greek myths of apotheosis. He was affirming the Jewish hope of resurrection, where the body isn't discarded, but glorified. So now we see the tension. Greek dualism says the body is flawed and must be left behind. Jewish theology says the body is good and will be redeemed. So where does Paul fit into this? Is he borrowing from the Greek culture, or is he staying faithful to his Jewish roots? This is where the Deuteronomic connection becomes essential. By grounding his theology in texts like Deuteronomy 4:15-19, Paul shows that his vision of resurrection isn't about abandoning the body. It's about fulfilling God's cosmic design for creation. But what does this transformation look like? How does Paul imagine the body being glorified within this framework? When Paul describes the body as sown in dishonor but raised in glory, he's drawing on two interconnected ideas: cosmic order and resurrection ontology. These ideas aren't just abstract theology, they unlock how Paul understands transformation in the resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 15:39-41, Paul describes the resurrection body using the language of God's ordered creation. He draws directly from Deuteronomy 4:15-19, where Moses describes a hierarchy of terrestrial and celestial realms. Humans, animals, birds, and fish belong to the earth, while the sun, moon, and stars rule in the heavens. Each part of creation has its own glory, its divinely assigned purpose and role in God's cosmic order. Paul isn't just describing creation's structure for the sake of it. He's pointing us towards something deeper, something that reveals how the resurrection body fits into this cosmic design. The body that is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. Paul uses the metaphor of planting a seed to describe the relationship between the earthly body and the resurrection body. But here's the question. If a seed transforms into a plant, does it stop being what it was? Or does it become something greater while retaining continuity with what came before? Paul is telling us that the resurrection body does not replace the earthly body. It is a transformation of it. Just like the seed, the earthly body is sown in weakness, but it is glorified into something far greater. The key is transformation, not replacement. This brings us back to the idea of glory in Deuteronomy. Glory refers to the unique purpose and role assigned to each part of creation. The sun has one kind of glory, the moon another, and the stars yet another. Paul applies this concept to the resurrection body, just as the celestial bodies have been assigned their own glory with God's cosmic order. The resurrection body is glorified for its new role in God's eschatological plan. It's no longer subject to decay or weakness, but it reflects the fullness of God's redemptive work. So what Paul is describing here is not detachment from physicality. It's the transformation of physicality into something far greater. So Paul's talk of the resurrection, therefore, is not a vague spiritual afterlife. He's describing a glorified, transformed creation, one where the physical body is redeemed and elevated to reflect God's ultimate design. But Paul's vision does not stop there. If the resurrection body reflects transformation, what does that mean for the world itself? Paul connects this transformation to something even bigger: Christ's cosmic victory over death and evil. In 1 Corinthians 15, 20 through 28, Paul connects the resurrection of Christ's triumph over death itself, the ultimate enemy. This isn't just about individual redemption, it's about the renewal of the entire created order. Paul begins this section by describing Christ's resurrection as the first fruits, a term rich with Old Testament significance. In ancient Israel, the first fruits were the initial portion of the harvest offered to God, symbolizing both gratitude for what he had provided and a guarantee of the harvest to come. By calling Christ the first fruits, Paul is making another profound statement. Christ's resurrection is not an isolated event. It's the beginning of a much larger harvest. It guarantees the resurrection of all who belong to him. And then in 1 Corinthians 15, 24 through 26, Paul describes Christ's ultimate mission: to destroy every ruler, authority, and power opposed to God's reign, culminating in the destruction of death itself. Paul writes, "Then comes the end, when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father, after he has destroyed every ruler, authority, and power. The last enemy to be destroyed is death." For Paul, death isn't just a biological reality, it's a cosmic power that entered the world through sin. Christ's resurrection is the definitive act that breaks death's stranglehold on creation. And this is why Christ is called the second Adam earlier in 1 Corinthians 15, where the first Adam brought death through disobedience, and the second Adam brings life through resurrection. Christ's victory over death isn't just personal, it's cosmic, reversing the curse of sin and death introduced into the world. By now, you're starting to see the picture. Paul's vision of resurrection doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It's deeply rooted in the Old Testament's hope for cosmic restoration. For example, in Isaiah 25:8, we read, "He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces." And in Psalm 82, God judges corrupt spiritual powers, reclaiming his rightful rule over creation. These texts form the backdrop for Paul's claim that Christ's resurrection inaugurates God's final victory over evil. Therefore, for Paul, the resurrection is inseparable from the eschatological hope of God's kingdom. When Christ destroys death and hands the kingdom over to the Father, the entire created order is restored. 1 Corinthians 15:28 says, "When all things are subjected to him, then the Son himself will also be subjected to the one who subjected all things to him, so that God may be all in all." This is Paul's ultimate vision, a world where God reigns complete, where death and evil are no more, and where creation reflects its original purpose, to glorify God fully. So, what does this all mean with regards to Paul's theology? The resurrection isn't just about individual hope, it's about cosmic renewal. Christ's resurrection guarantees the resurrection of believers, but it also ensures the destruction of death, the defeat of evil, and the restoration of all things under God's reign. In other words, Paul's vision of resurrection isn't just personal, it's universal, cosmic, and transformative. Now, one question might still remain. Why does this matter for us today? The answer lies in how the resurrection addresses some of the most profound questions of human existence. Questions about death, meaning, and the hope for a world made new. The resurrection is more than a theological concept, therefore. It's a promise of renewal. When Paul says, the body is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory, he's not just talking about the transformation of an individual body. He's pointing to a broader truth, that no part of creation is beyond God's redemptive reach. And this means that death doesn't have the final word, not for us and not for the world. For Paul, Christ's resurrection is the guarantee that all things will, one day, be made new. This is the hope we see echoed in Revelation 21:4. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Paul's vision gives us a hope not just for the future, but for the present. It assures us that our suffering, our grief, and even our broken world are not the end of the story. The resurrection points us toward the day when God will restore all things. And the resurrection is not just a future hope. It's a call to live differently now. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. The resurrection changes everything. It means that the work we do, whether it's fighting for justice, caring for the hurting, or creating beauty, it all matters. It's not wasted because it's part of God's redemptive plan. It's not just a matter of faith, it's a historical claim, and one that invites us to explore its evidence and implications. If this video has helped you see the resurrection in a new light, let me know in the comments. And if you want to explore more about faith, theology, and history, make sure to like and subscribe. Together, let's keep uncovering the depth of the Christian faith.